Thank you very much, Renee. Um, and thank you all for joining me today. I look forward to talking to you more about problem sexual behaviors. As I was introduced, just a few more things about me. That I've been an educator for over 20 years. I started in the field as a special education teacher in New York City public schools, where I worked with mostly in the elementary age range. And then I went to the University of Washington to get my doctorate, and since then have been a professor at different universities. And right now I'm an associate professor at California State University, East Bay, where I support credential students and masters. They're also master students who are working towards their education specialist credential, which is what California calls the special education credential or license. So that's my main focus. I've also been a BCBA since 2011, and most recently have begun working at, within the past couple of years, working with Empowered, providing direct services to young adults and adults related to sexual behaviors. Most of my clients are DMH, Department of Mental Health in Missouri, and I provide direct service through telehealth. And then just one additional thing so that we understand where I get the competencies around sexual behavior analysis is I have completed a certificate in sexual health from the University of Michigan, and that's where I have gotten my basis for sexual competency, in addition to other professional development around that. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And I will just note really quickly, I forgot to put the slide in, that I will be talking about sexual behavior. I will not show anything explicit. I will use medically accurate terms, but will not show anything explicit or provide anything that is could be shocking, but I will use medically accurate terms. So my intent for today is to overview some problem sexual behavior, and I'll note the quotations around that in a bit and explain that. I will give some information on responding to sexual behaviors and some planning that can be put towards addressing sexual behaviors. I have actually a couple of case studies that we can review, and then some resources, as well as we'll do a Q&A and wrap up. These are the objectives. They were on the flyer, so I won't spend a whole lot of time, but as I've noted, I'm a BCBA, so I'm going to take this from a behavior analytic perspective, and I'm going to be talking about functional behavior assessment and addressing sexual behavior, since that is my professional lens towards addressing any kind of behaviors that we need some support in. I will also talk about identifying non-sexual causes for behaviors that may appear sexual. And then overall through our case study, we'll kind of engage in some reflection on how we address problem sexual behavior. So in order to start this conversation on problem sexual behavior, and I put it in quotations because problem is always one of those words that there's a lot of association with, associating that this is an issue, that this is a problem, but who's it a problem for? And is it really a problem, or is there we just have different kind of circumstances to address? So I always feel funny calling something a problem behavior when we don't really know what's going on. It could be a perfectly normal developmental behavior, and it's just the context that needs some shaping. It could be that there is like a medical issue going on. So it looks like a problem to us, but it's a medical issue that's going on with the individual. So that's why I put problem in quotation marks, is because I always feel kind of funny talking about someone's behavior as a problem when it's working for them. And we just need to figure out oh, okay, well, this is causing an issue with access to environments. This is causing an issue for them potentially. So that's why I put problem in quotation marks. So in order to start this, I wanted to talk about common developmental behaviors that look sexual, and try to normalize what is typical. And so then when we take this information, these next two slides, where we're talking about appropriate developmental behaviors that might look sexual in younger children and youth, when we are thinking about our population with intellectual and developmental disabilities who may be behind in developmental milestones, we might be able to see a bit bigger of a context of, yes, this is not something we would expect for a 13-year-old, but if they are slightly behind developmentally, we might see some of those kind of coming a little bit later, and we can put it into that context. So that's why I'm going to start with talking about common behaviors that we see over the next couple of slides and help us get that foundation. And one of the other reasons that I like to talk about this is that sexuality education in the United States is wildly varies depending on where you grew up, when you grew up, what state you're in, what county or district you're in. And so we don't have a lot of consistency with sexuality education and kind of that foundational knowledge of typical development across sexuality. So I'm trying to help shore up some of that knowledge in that area. Some of you may already be familiar with us, and that's awesome. We'll jump ahead to the next thing that you'll grab something new from. So common sexual behavior from ages 2 to 12 are these. They're exploratory and spontaneous. They occur with children that are of the same age, size, developmental level. So what that means is that we're not talking about children that are multiple years difference. We're talking about children that they're both 3 years old or 5 years old or 6 years old, right? That they're at the same level. It also occurs intermittently, and there's mutual agreement. So we want to really call that consent necessarily, but it's agreement that this is okay. Hey, can I give you a kiss? I don't know what a kiss feels like. Or I'm curious what a kiss feels like. And they engage in that. And then the other kind of very common thing about this is that if they are caught doing something that appears sexual by a caregiver, parents, guardians, whoever, and they're told to stop, that they do stop. Or they at least decrease it. There's that happens. So that's very common. This happens. This is part of typical development. That exploration is very common among children ages 2 to 12. Now here, I've got it broken down into smaller age groups, and these are developmentally typical behaviors that are related to sexuality. So we can see things like from 0 to 4, things like being naked, touching their own genitals, maybe wanting to touch genitals of others is very common. That does not indicate that there's a problem or they've been exposed to something they shouldn't have been. That curiosity, that exploration is very typical for ages 0 to 4. They're also don't have the refined social skills that we would expect, right? So things like standing too close to somebody, asking inappropriate questions, those kinds of things happen at 0 to 4 years old. That's very typical. And we wouldn't be concerned necessarily about a 3-year-old that's doing these kinds of behaviors. It's ages 5 to 9 that we start seeing children wanting more privacy, in showing more curiosity about sexuality, maybe talking about where do babies come from. I want to get married, or I want to marry a parent. Oftentimes we hear that they want to marry a parent. And so there's more discussions around that. And then 10 to 13, they're starting to use more sexual language. They may be talking to peers and getting some language from them. They might have some interest in having a boyfriend or girlfriend type of relationship. I'm purposely skipping the masturbation because I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So I'm purposely skipping that for now. And then 14 to 17, if you've come to my other talks about porn literacy, we know that that is the age group that is viewing more porn, maybe accidentally or on purpose for learning about information or just for arousal purposes. They might get involved in sexual activities at this age as well. That's very typical. So having an understanding of what typical behavior is really helps us understand when there's an issue, when we might be concerned about what's going on. So I pulled this quote from the American Academy of Family Physicians because, and there's, this wouldn't be the only place I could pull it from, but this, I liked the way that this was phrased, because sometimes when we see behaviors, even these on here, something like 5 to 9 years old masturbating in private, maybe somebody catches a child masturbating in private, and there might be some concern that, oh gosh, did they see something? Did something happen to them? But knowing that that's actually a typical behavior can help us put a pause in our reaction and help us understand like typical development, and also help us understand that a lot of these behaviors, especially younger, are not really sexually based. They're not really about sexuality. They're about curiosity, and masturbating, especially ages 5 to 9, that's going to be more about that just feels really good. So that's why I've pulled this quote that I'm going to read right now. Children do not necessarily engage in sexual behaviors for sexual gratification. Curiosity, imitation of observed sexual behaviors, attention seeking, and self-soothing are other reasons children may behave sexually. In general, sexual behaviors that are solitary or that do not involve contact are common and frequently observed. So just kind of putting it into context that some of those behaviors, you know, masturbation being one, it just feels really good. And some kids just find that really young. Some children find that young. I will give you some clues into when it would be a problem, when we would want to be concerned and intervene. So when a behavior is disruptive or coercive, that's when we want to be concerned about sexual behaviors. So even if it seems like it might be a typically development, you know, masturbating in private for one thing, or engaging in some exploratory play with others, if we note that it's become disruptive and or coercive, then we're going to be concerned about those sexual behaviors, because now it's fallen outside of that typical development trajectory. So examples of concerning behaviors might be masturbating compulsively or to the point of causing injury. That one in particular, we're going to be concerned about what has happened that we have gotten to the point of it being compulsive, like they have a hard time stopping. They're doing it multiple times a day. They're hurting themselves. They're causing injury to their genitals. What is happening here? What's the compulsion? Is there a medical reason for that? Are they not able to complete? So they know about this and they know that it feels good, but they're not able to complete. And that can cause frustration and can cause some problems with that. Or is there something else going on? We're going to talk about some of the other things that might be happening if we're witnessing behaviors that look like that. Other things on here that you've probably already read in my talking about that are, you know, forcing others to engage in activities or exchanging money or items for sexual activity. That would be coercive, right? And so we're going to be concerned about those kinds of behaviors. Touching others, sending like sexting materials or emailing materials to themselves or others, to other people. Those are coercive and disruptive, and those are definitely problems. Now, this is a small list. There may be other behaviors that are also concerning. Even, let's see, my bullet point number 4, often touching the genitals of others. Not even just necessarily genitals of others, but just touching others in areas that you wouldn't expect, like touching women's breasts or coming up and hugging people without asking. That may not be quite as severe, but it's still a behavior of concern. If we have a 4-year-old doing that, that's one thing. Touching others, that's one thing. But if we have a 17-year-old who is often coming up and touching others, hugging people, those kinds of things, we want to be concerned because that has the potential for limiting environments later, or having an accusation of harassment at some point. And I bring that up specifically because we know with some populations within IDD, in particular, I'm thinking of those with Down syndrome. When they are younger, a lot of that population is very loving and like cuddly, and people are very drawn to those young children, and we'll kind of let them, hug and sit on laps and those kinds of things. And then as they get older, if people continue to allow that and not teach those boundaries around asking to touch others, it can turn into a problem. As cute as it is when they're 4, it's not so cute when we're 17, 18, 25, and we're doing those kinds of behaviors. That can lead to problems in the community, and it can lead to issues around like, what are the boundaries around how we touch people and getting consent to touch people. So some of those they're okay at some points and they're not okay at other points. So we want to be taking care of that. But overall, even if an example doesn't fall under my list here, anything that's disruptive or coercive, we're going to be concerned about and we want to take a look at. So what if you're concerned and it's not on the list? It's disruptive or it's coerced or coercive, then we want to seek additional support. So I am going to talk through some ways that these problem behaviors might be addressed. And I also want to put it out there that contacting a pediatrician or consulting with a sexuality educator or sexual behavior analyst, an SBA, is also very helpful. Especially some of these behaviors can be quite concerning and may fall out of your scope of being able to support for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's something that you don't see very often, or it's triggering, or it has the potential for escalating into something that lands into the criminal justice system realm. Then we want to definitely get some consultation at least, or referral. So just providing that information out there. And if at any point we do believe that there is sexual abuse that has occurred, and that's what has modeled a behavior for somebody, then we definitely want to reach out to law enforcement and follow your mandated reporting guidelines around that. So beyond typically developmentally typical behaviors, there are reasons that sexually appearing behavior may be occurring. And this is where I really want to hit and help us see some more context. Because when we see some of these behaviors, it can be really shocking. And we can have our own experiences around that. And so having this framework that there might be something else going on can help us put a little pause in and maybe look at the behavior in a different way. It seems to me that when we have a behavior that appears sexual in nature, sometimes we forget how we address any other kind of behavior that may be occurring that's disruptive or environment limiting. And we want to do the same thing for behaviors that appear sexual. It can be a bit more shocking. It feels a bit more urgent as well because of the disruption it can cause in the environment. So a reason that we might see a behavior that is sexually appearing are medical reasons. And that is, number one, when I'm going to talk about functional behavior assessment, we always want to start with that medical or physiological reason, just to see if one of those might be something in that realm might be causing or setting the event for that behavior to occur. So some of those reasons are UTIs, infections, pain, or discomfort. So, somebody who is masturbating compulsively, is it actually masturbation, or is it possible that they have a UTI and that they're trying to find a way to remove that discomfort from the UTI or a yeast infection? Young boys, young men, can have testicles that get twisted, that can cause pain and discomfort. That has to be addressed immediately. There could also be, my clinic director talks about a case where there was a client who the referral was the client is humping in different rooms in the house. They're laying down on the floor and they're humping and trying to figure out what was going on. Well, what kinds of floors? They're harder floors. Well, they go through the process and found that the client had an impacted bowel. So that was the only way to get relief from that impacted bowel. So it looked like humping, but it wasn't actually humping. It was to relieve some pain that was occurring. So there are medical reasons that there could be sexually appearing behavior. So we also definitely want to rule that out, especially if we have somebody whose communication is not consistent or not clear to others, or they have very few options for communication. A lack of skills. Are they masturbating without completion, and so they're unsatisfied, and so they're keep trying and trying and trying and trying, and so now the masturbation becomes compulsive. They're doing it in other environments. They don't know public versus private behaviors, things that need to be, this is a really important skill, public versus private behaviors, especially for populations where they're getting a lot of support, particularly in toileting or bathing, and they don't have a lot of private opportunities. We definitely need to work on teaching those public versus private behaviors for those individuals in particular, but for all of our individuals we support, in making sure that they understand like what's a public thing and what's a private thing. And then regulation and impulse control. I know that impulse control can be a really challenging skill to work on, but it is one that the population, the IDD population, some have a really difficult time with. And if they feel some way, they may just go ahead and do it, like touching others. And so we want to work on those impulse control skills as well as regulation. I've already mentioned communication. What communication skills do they have? Can they tell others if something has happened to them? Can they tell others if something is hurting them? Something doesn't feel good. Are they able to communicate that? And then do they have the right words to communicate that as well? Talking about like actual anatomy words and not euphemisms for body parts so that others can understand them. Desire with no opportunity. We can see that especially in our teenagers who are seeing their peers, going on dates, and our young adults may not have opportunity. So we can talk about other ways to address those opportunities, but is that something that's occurring? And we also are going to consider if abuse is possible. We know with the IDD population that sexual abuse is at minimum 4 times higher than the regular population, the neurotypical population, and other rates can be 7 or more times higher, depending on the specific population within IDD. So we know that sexual abuse is really high in this population. So that is something that is possible, that has occurred, and we're going to consider that as well. And consider, what that might mean for planning. So overall, my recommendation on this is that we want to approach it with curiosity and try to consider what all the factors might be contributing to the problem behavior. Even though the behavior, the way that it looks, may be difficult and challenging, we're still going to consider the different possibilities for what may be occurring in order to help us decide what may be the best way forward. So responding to behavior is very normal to react. They can catch us off guard. We see somebody, we have somebody that we're supporting and we're out in public and they start, putting their hands down their pants and masturbating, like that can be really catching us off guard. But my advice is to respond and not react. So overreacting can exacerbate the behavior. As a behavior analyst, what I'm always concerned about is when we react very bigly, bigly isn't a word, but when we act very big to a behavior, we could unintentionally add a function onto that behavior. We could add attention onto that behavior. That behavior, maybe it was not ever intended as an attention behavior, a behavior where they receive attention. But if our reactions are quite big, we could inadvertently add that on. That, oh gosh, I got a really cool reaction out of everybody when I did that. Now I'm going to do it not only for the first reason that I was doing it, is that it felt good, or whatever the reason was, but now I know that I can get people's attention when I do this behavior. And so I'm gonna do that too. So we always want to be very careful about that. It's really hard though. And I completely understand. I work with teachers on a daily basis, and there's a lot going on in classrooms, and sometimes you're going to react the way you're going to react. But we can take that breath, if we can take that moment, deep breath, and then we step in and respond, then it can be a little bit more helpful in kind of keeping a neutral event, right? And responding doesn't mean that we don't do anything. Responding means that we just take a breath and then saying like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're doing that. We take a breath and then we redirect. Oh, you need to do that in the bathroom. Or, oh, I need your hands up on the desk or up on the table. And we can redirect in whatever is appropriate in that moment, whatever makes sense in that moment. And then we can come up with a plan, right? So this is taking that deep breath and then responding can be really helpful just to put that pause in. Next, we're going to come up with a plan to address, right? Again, like I've talked about for a while, is if there's a medical reason, if it's not medical and it's not developmentally appropriate, then we definitely want to consult further. And then we're going to access resources. So information gathering, learning some more, background, like I said earlier at the start of this, that we are often lacking in our knowledge. And we can learn more in order to have some more confidence. So going to things like this increases your confidence so that you can feel more confident in addressing in the future. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about a functional behavior assessment. So this is my tool as a BCBA for determining the functions of behavior, even sexual behaviors. We're going to use an FBA. So some behaviors are not going to be observable. So usually, for those of you who are familiar with FBAs or maybe have been trained in FBAs, you know that mostly we want to be able to observe that behavior. We want to be able to watch it, see what's happening before, during, and after. For sexual behaviors, we may not be able to do that. That would violate ethics. So that sometimes people are like, don't put that together, that we can use an FBA for sexual behaviors even if the behavior is not observable. We're told that in the white book. All right, my BCBAs know what we're talking about with the white book, the Cooper book, that they say you don't have to observe the behavior in order to conduct an FBA. We can still conduct an FBA to determine the function. We also really like FBAs because we're always including a medical consideration. If there's any, we're going to look at the medication. We're going to consult with physicians as needed, with medical doctors, nurses, whoever's appropriate. We're going to consult and see if this is medically, it was something medical that's occurring. If there's some physiological reason this might be occurring. And then an FBA is also going to give us an opportunity to determine skills that we want to develop, right? Because a part of an FBA is also coming up with a plan. We get to plan for if that behavior is going to happen again, how are we going to react next time? And we can come up with a plan. And we're also going to come up with skills, right? We're going to work on that. So rule out medical concerns, Can also use an FBA to assess values. What are the values of the individual and the family? What are the goals of each stakeholder? I include goals in my FBAs. I include goals of each stakeholder, from my client to the parent or guardian to the staff, the support staff that are supporting my client. What are the goals of each stakeholder? I'm going to include those in the FBA because that's going to help an overall picture of what skills we're going to work on and what progress means in addressing that behavior. FBA can also help us in identifying the sociosexual knowledge and skills. So what might we need to focus on? What kind of skills might we need to learn? And where we're going to focus our instruction. We can also ensure that those skills are aligned to the values. And then behavior shaping opportunities. Can the behavior be shaped? If we have somebody who is masturbating in public, masturbation is okay. People do it. People are allowed to do it, just not allowed to do it in public. Is it a matter of moving and shaping that behavior to a private location? If there's problems with the form of masturbation we're not completing, then is there an issue with teaching the actual steps and skills? And I am not, please disclaimer, I am not suggesting that a BCBA or anybody in here is the person to teach somebody the steps for masturbation. I'm not suggesting that whatsoever. This is about finding out the information. Is it a location? Is it a form? Is it access? And we can shape that behavior in more socially appropriate, less harmful or restrictive forms. So my basis as a BCBA is always, is this a behavior that is going to cause restriction in access to some environment? Yes. Okay. Well, then is it an inappropriate behavior otherwise? No. Okay. Well, where is it appropriate? And that's where we want to have that behavior. Okay. Because the last thing I want is my clients to be restricted anymore in access to community, to other settings, to work settings, vocational settings, whatever it is, right? I want them to have access to that. So we need to shape the behaviors for something that's more appropriate. It's appropriate in private. Okay, we're going to teach how to do that, what to do that in private, and make sure that that remains a private skill or private behavior, excuse me. And then we can also look at other considerations. Is impulse control a factor? Oftentimes, yes. We feel like we need to do something, we do it, does not matter what's going on around us. Impulse control issue, right? So we can work on impulse control skills, developing those skills. And same with self-regulation. I would approach it the same way if I had a target behavior that looked something related to aggression. Maybe it's going from 0 to 100 very quickly, escalating very quickly. I would approach it the same way. Are we missing some skills? Probably. We probably have some impulse control. We probably have some self-regulation skills. So I'm going to address it in the same way. Do the same thing with any behavior that appears sexual in nature. For those that aren't familiar with functional behavior assessments, I wanted to give just a little briefing on some of the components of an FBA. So one process that we do, and that you could do this, you could use something like this to kind of take a look at separating it out. This is a way of taking anecdotal data, but in a little bit more structured of a format. This is ABC data. So in this data, we observe what occurs directly before the behavior, the antecedent, the behavior itself, and then what happens immediately after the behavior, a consequence. So in behavior analyst world, consequence does not always mean something bad. It just means whatever happens after the behavior. Mainstream, consequence means something bad all the time. But the actual term just means something that happens after a behavior occurs. Okay. It doesn't have to be bad. It doesn't have to be good. It's just whatever happens afterwards. So this helps us kind of separate the event into these different structures. What happens before, what the actual behavior is, what happens immediately after. So we can kind of see like, oh, this is the process of what's going on. And we can kind of separate out make it a little bit more objective, right? Especially with sexually appearing behaviors, we can get kind of subjective in our language and put some qualities onto the behavior that may not actually like exist themselves. So data collection like this can help us separate out what is occurring, and be really systematic about like, oh, this behavior seems to happen every time a demand is put on to this person, that every time they're asked to do something, or every time they're asked to move on to a different activity. Now we're seeing the behavior. I can kind of start seeing a pattern of when the behavior is occurring. And then the consequence, the same thing we analyze for that too. Every time they engage in this behavior, they're moved to a different space, or the task is taken away from them, or they're given more time to do something. We know then that, oh, that might be helping the behavior continue, because they're allowed to get out of doing whatever we're asking them to do, or they're allowed to stay doing something longer. So maybe we need to build more skills on like asking for help or asking for some more time on something. So that kind of helps us identify those patterns. I'm sorry, I did see a chat pop up, but I cannot get the chat up for some reason.
Yeah, so the question in the chat is asking, how do we program around impulse control?
Yes. Okay. So my approach for that is one way of doing that is tolerance for delay, and tolerance around a stimulant. So depending on what the impulse control, like what that kind of looks like, we could do tolerance for delay in not getting something right away. We can, by seconds, wait 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and build that out, to build that tolerance for delay. Another approach is tolerance around a stimulant, or a stimulus, sorry, not a stimulant, sorry, stimulus. So we have whatever the stimulus is. Say, some of my clients have food issues. They will, if there's food around, they're going to eat it. And that's okay, but also it can be harmful to health. So we might have like an Oreo cookie or a half of an Oreo cookie there. And we're going to wait 30 seconds. We're going to put it there and we're going to wait 30 seconds before you can, before you can have that. And next time we're going to wait 45 seconds. And then we're going to build that up so that you can be around that item without needing to go to it right away. And whatever the earliest, the lowest time is whatever I know they're going to be successful at. So if I know 30 seconds is too long, I'm going to move that down to like 10 seconds, right? Whatever the lowest is where I'm going to start so that they can be successful right away. I want to do this in an errorless learning style. And while that means is that I'm not trying to set up a situation where they're going to fail. I'm trying to set up a situation where they're going to succeed. Others, food is one thing. I've also heard from other clinicians. I had a colleague they had a client who wanted to work at a movie theater, and they had TVs playing at the movie theater, and they would get very distracted by the TVs. So in order to help them get ready to work at a movie theater where this is going to be going on, they did a whole program on a TV playing, and can you not pay attention to that? And did the same thing that I just talked about. Started with 30 seconds and moved it all the way up to whatever the appropriate time was. I think it was like half an hour, something like that was where they determined would be mastery. Having the TV playing, and can you just not pay attention to that for that period of time? So being around the stimulus and not being distracted by it is a way to train for impulse control. Yeah, questions?
Yeah, I was the one that originally asked that question. I was just wondering about generalization to the topic we're discussing today.
Yeah, so, okay. So like touching somebody or like a sexual behavior?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So first, I'm not going to train it on a sexual behavior. I'm going to train it on something else, because most of the time, if we have impulse control related to something that's a sexual behavior, we also have impulse control around something else. So I'm going to work on that, because that's going to be much more appropriate for me as a clinician to work on than trying to spend a session blocking somebody from touching somebody else, right? So we're going to work on impulse control in a non-sexual behavior. And then we can work on impulse control. I'm going to collect data on, has it generalized? And if it hasn't, then we're going to put in some programming around like keywords and other support for staff around impulse control. So when I'm training impulse control, it's not just me as a clinician working with a client. I'm also training staff on what impulse control looks like. Does that help make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I have like a very specific example, but it's very complex. So maybe I'll email you after if that's okay.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. I'm glad that this has been a great conversation. So this, for those who are not familiar, this little corner at the bottom is what an example data sheet might look like. A very simple data sheet might look like for ABC data. Conducting an FBA, my caveat on this is FBA should only be conducted by those who are trained in conducting them, which is mainly BCBAs, but special educators in many places are also trained in FBAs, but we're not going to do an FBA if we're not trained in that. But my purpose here is to give to pull the curtain back a little bit and, make it clear what an FBA process might look like. So FBA, again, is functional behavior assessment. Just for those who, maybe are working with those who are doing FBAs, just trying to help you understand some of the processes that are going on. So like I've said over and over again, we always are looking at medical impact or life changes too. I am always, always want to know if medication has been changed, if a home has been changed, something has been changed in the environment. Given the clients that I now work with, I also want to know if staffing has changed because that can also impact behavior. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to conduct the FBA. It just means that it's something I'm considering within the whole context of the FBA. Okay. The next is data collection. There's a lot of data collection. Even if you aren't conducting an FBA, you might be asked to do an interview or questionnaire or to collect data that is used to inform the functional behavior assessment. So there's a data collection process that occurs. There might also be assessments that occur within that too. And I'm going to show a couple of sociosexual assessments that can be used as well. Data is then analyzed and we develop a hypothesis about the function, like what is the maintaining function of this behavior. And then we develop a plan. So that's the behavior support plan that addresses how we're going to try to prevent the behavior from occurring in the future. Those are also called antecedent strategies. What skills we're going to teach, so any replacement behaviors, skill development, and then if the behavior does occur, the target behavior does occur, how we're going to respond in the future to occurrences of that behavior. So I have some examples of assessments that might be used. My suggestion is not that you all should be using these, at least 2 of these. You must be trained to implement the assessment, but I'm just giving you some information about assessments. I have found over the past couple of years that many people are not familiar with sociosexual assessments that can be used with the IDD population. And so I wanted to make sure I brought those up so that you're aware. These are just 3 of them. There are more, but I decided to highlight 3. One is the SCAT-R. I put /3 because it's in field testing right now to be edited to become the SCAT-3. You need to be trained to implement this, but it's a criterion-based assessment. Those being assessed must have verbal language for this. So it does limit some of the population away from the SCAT3, but it can be really useful. And it is specifically for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So that one's a really helpful one. The TalkSC is another one. I've got a lot of caveats on that one, but you need to be trained and supervised to implement it. It can't be used to withhold sexual activities from people, but it is a skills assessment for capacity to consent across domains. And the results of it allow for really specific skill development around consent. And being able to really pinpoint, because consent isn't one thing or another. It's a conglomerate of skills. Like it's a pretty complex set of skills, but the TalkSC can help practitioners identify areas of skill development. And then TIASC is something that's used with the PEERS program, if you're familiar with PEERS, but it can be used out of PEERS for some general social skills, understanding it's specifically for young adults with ASD, but it has been used with other populations as well. We have just enough time to look at a couple of cases using an FBA approach. So I have case scenario with Malik. Malik is 15 years old with a moderate intellectual disability, touches peers on arm or shoulder without permission, hugs peers from behind, or hugged a peer from behind, and the student was upset. When they were redirected, they said, well, we're friends. They asked peers about boyfriends and girlfriends in intrusive ways, and at home are asking questions about dating and sex. The parents are frustrated, they complain about, lack of information, needing support, and the principal has come to the teacher to ask for some next steps. So my discussion questions are, what would be the steps for what would we do for a functional behavior assessment? Any skills assessment or intervention planning, some immediate priorities? How would we kind of work towards addressing Malik? Sorry, I still can't get my comments up or the chat up.
Yeah, that hasn't been in chat, but if someone puts something in the chat, I can read it aloud.
Okay.
Or feel free to unmute yourself. Like just.
Well, the scenario doesn't really give a lot of information about what is his home environment like, what type of activities he's involved in, if there's any other concerns that they've seen, any med changes. So I guess I would want to get all that information first.
Okay. Yeah, getting some information from a family would definitely be important. I won't torture us, but we'd also want to know what kind of consent skills does Malik have about asking for, to touch somebody, to give somebody a hug. And also we'd want to know what Malik understands about different kinds of relationships, right? Because Malik says, but we're friends. And understanding like what the boundaries are around friendship and what kind of different relationships are. Definitely see that Malik is interested in that, asking about boyfriends and girlfriends, asking about dating and sex. There's definitely an interest there. So we'd want to know, what does Malik already know and what could we help Malik understand? And I think the immediate priority would definitely be around touching others without consent, because that is something that could develop into a bigger issue. Right? Okay, one more I have is Alex. Alex is a 14-year-old student with a mild intellectual disability. Observed putting hands in pants in class and transitions. Redirected, but behavior often resumes. The peers have noticed and they started teasing, causing a disruption. They're making note of they're being embarrassed about seeing that. Parents see the same behavior at home when Alex is anxious or bored, and the teacher has requested a team meeting to determine next steps. So same kind of thing. What might we consider here? You don't have to take my questions verbatim. You could just, what might you do?
I would possibly get like a replacement behavior by using like something else besides the hands in the pants. I would be doing like maybe redirect their hands to something else, like a fidget or something like that.
And when they see that it's occurring when he gets anxious or bored, then you kind of know when to watch for it, when it's going to be elevated a little bit more. And then you can work on ways to avoid or, assist with the anxiety or, the boredom, get him involved in something. Those are just small things.
Huh. Yeah, that definitely helps knowing the seeing it when we're anxious or bored. That definitely helps. Yeah.
And also kind of talking about what's private and what's not private and where do we do those things.
Exactly. Yes.
So
That would fall under the immediate priority about the private space.
Definitely. Oh, okay. Finally, I got the chat. It's finally. Yes. Okay. Maybe observe Malik in different environments. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Malik is the last one. This is Alex. Okay. Sorry. I just finally got access to the chat. It just popped up for me. Using timers. Yes. I think that really is helpful, knowing, getting that information from parents, that we see it when Alex is anxious or bored, and we can kind of then see in other settings, is that when it's occurring too. And the redirect, that helps us with planning for redirect, and planning, and then being able to teach those skills about public and private. Yeah, excellent. Very good. Okay, I have to start wrapping up. So some key takeaways are problem sexual behavior can stem from skill deficits, sensory needs, or lack of knowledge. So knowing that it's, even though the form of the behavior can be shocking and cause us, like, oh gosh, what's happening? It's still addressing it in the same way that we would other behaviors that are causing problems. FBAs can help us identify triggers, functions, and consequences. Sexuality knowledge and skills assessments can help us understand the different skills that might be missing in boundaries, consent, public and private behavior. In interventions, we're going to focus on teaching replacement skills, collaborating with families, and also respecting dignity. So even if the problem behavior, quote unquote problem behavior, is something that's quite triggering or disturbing, that we still are approaching this with a dignity, and we're in order to support access to different environments. And so inclusion, right, is the ultimate goal, is ensuring that inclusion in all environments is available. I have some online resources. These aren't actually different from the past resources I've provided at previous talks I've given. But if you haven't been able to join me in past Amaze videos are ones I'm going to point out. I use Amaze videos. It's a free video resource on sexuality education topics. It covers so many different topics. I use them very consistently in my practice. Right now, I'm focused on sexually transmitted infections, and they have a lot of really great engaging videos that I'm using for STIs. But they have a lot of different videos. They're really helpful. And then some book resources. Some of them are the same that I've been sharing before, but two that I wanted to highlight are A 5 is Against the Law. Is a program that I use with my clients. And this teaches boundaries in a very clear way, in a very direct way. It's categorizing behaviors based on if they are typical behaviors that people expect versus that's against the law. And we can't do that. And it can be very explicit. Like some social rules can be really hard for the IDD population. And this just categorizes it. It makes it really super clear what the line is. So A 5 is against the law. I've also modified it to like a 3 or a 4 is against the law, depending on who I'm working with. If 5 is too many categories, we can always make adjustments and modify that. But the program is A 5 against the law. And then zones of regulation. So teaching self-regulation and emotional control, especially we were talking a little bit more about impulse control. Zones of regulation is really a really important foundation around that. And many of our individuals have learned something around that in school. If they have they've received IEP supports and services, they've gotten something around regulation, whether it's how does my engine run, or the incredible 5-point scale, or something like that. Zones of regulation is quite similar to that as well. So teaching that impulse control and self-regulation. And then I have some others on here that are more general, but taking care of yourself, dating. And then my favorite right now is Porn is Not Sex Ed is my favorite book right now to take a look at. It's really engaging. So that's what I have for you all today. Thank you so much for such an engaging